Welcome to this breakout session on the transatlantic agenda for the Middle East. My name is Patrycja Sasnal. I'm the head of the Middle East and North Africa project at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, who are co-organizers of this event. And the lineup, the honorable lineup of our panel is a little bit different from what you have in your booklets. We have an addition, a very honorable and welcome addition. And the panel is not perhaps the natural representation of the transatlantic community. It is certainly unorthodox, but it's perfectly tailored to the news today. In other words, there's a strong emphasis on Turkey. We have two Turkish participants, Orhan, whom you do not have in your programs, but who is an Istanbul-based director of the Atlantic Council Energy and Economic Summit. We have Özgür Ünlühisarcıklı, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who is the director of the Ankara office of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And then we have Gomati, who is the founder and the general director of a Sadeq Institute in Libya. And we also have the former Minister of Finance of Israel, Mr. Rony. What I thought, perhaps with this lineup, a little bit unorthodox in terms of talking about the transatlantic community, that we would do the following. I would ask you, gentlemen, to give us a perspective from the region of your expectations or the expectations of your countries for the transatlantic community, what the transatlantic community should have done, should do, will have to do. Where are the points of convergence between the US and the EU, whether there are any? How do you see the EU and the US in the region? This is perhaps this broad framework that I want to hear your remarks about. But the question about expectations is very difficult. I've just come back from Egypt, where I spent a month, and when you walk in the streets of Egypt, you hear criticism of the US and the EU constantly. It's omnipresent. You did this wrong, you did that wrong, you bombed Libya, you did not bomb Syria, you did all sorts of things wrong. And you hear it from everyone, the upper class, the lower class, even the people who are marked by what they call Uqdat al-Hawaga, the kind of foreigners problem that people have when they think highly of the West and low of the Arab world. They also speak critically of the US and the EU, although perhaps more of the US than the EU. So at some point I said, stop. Okay, if you think it's so bad, and I hear you, what do you think that we should do? What are your expectations? And actually silence and surprise was my answer. People could not articulate their expectations. And I think there is a reason for that. They could not articulate their expectations because perhaps they are not certain what they want. They don't know how Egypt will look in 10 years' time, and they don't know what they want, what they expect. They don't have a vision of Egypt. Perhaps it's the same in other countries. So I think that, in essence, the question about expectations is a very, very difficult one. So I'm going to give the floor to you and ask you about the expectations of your countries. Of course, we cannot run away from the events in Turkey today and over the past weeks. But I want you to factor in the challenges that there are in the Arab world, also, and in the Middle East in general. Also those that are not perhaps so obvious, like the Sunni-Shia Cold War, like many other things that I'm sure you're aware and you want to bring up. I want to start with Mr. Baron.
Yeah. Thank you, Patrycja. Good evening, everybody. Well, for the last couple of years, the regime was busy with a couple of landmark events that have a significant effect on Israel and beyond. First of all, we witnessed changing of guard in Egypt through a process of a revolution that shot to power a fundamental Islamistic party. Second landmark is the violent uprising in Syria, the brutal massacre that followed Assad, son of a minority, Alawite minority, less than 10%, is actually brutally killing up to today more than 100,000 people of the Sunni majority, while the world, unfortunately, is keeping silent. The third one, we have also witnessed the tightening economical sanctions, international economical sanctions against Iran. These sanctions have not yet altered the Iranian way of thinking, but they are a significant step in the right direction, the sanctions actually. This must, and there is another event that actually it didn't happen, the final landmark, that didn't happen actually in the passing couple of years, is in my opinion the most significant one, the dialogue between Israel and the Palestinian Authority that unfortunately didn't happen. Renewal of the peace process didn't happen, and as a result of that is we see erosion of the stature of the Palestinian Authority, erosion that pushes the leaders to desperate, and the perception that there is no peaceful solution makes an environment of stormment, anger, bitterness, and the violence look like the only option. All of this possesses a dilemma for the international community. Here I come to the role that the EU and the United States have to play in this, that international community, although relatively friendly to Israel, it seeks to put an end to this conflict by a resolution that ends the Israeli settlement policy and includes withdrawal to some extent. As you know, people in Israel are divided. Some of them think that we shouldn't move even a millimeter from the occupied territories. As for myself, being a member of the government that went all the time to get an agreement with the Palestinian Authority, our Prime Minister have set a proposition to Mr. Abu Mazen, the President of the Palestinian Authority, that Mr. Abu Mazen himself said that have he continued to speak to Olmert after the proposition Olmert have said to him, within 3 months we would have an agreement. But bear in mind, nevertheless, Mr. Abu Mazen never said that he accepts the offer of Mr. Olmert. I think that's the role for the EU and the United States now to persuade Mr. Abu Mazen to declare that he is ready to accept the offer of Mr. Olmert, which he himself says he will never get such an offer again. And starting from this point, I think within a couple of months, not more than a year, we'll reach a final agreement which will bring this contradiction, this conflict between the State of Israel and the Palestinians to the end. That will not affect only the situation of Israel and the Palestinians. That will affect the whole Middle East. That will spread our ability to have better relations with the moderate Arab countries like Jordan, like Egypt, later on with Saudi Arabia and the Emirate, and this will affect the whole region. I think this is the thing, the role I would expect the EU and the US to play in this issue.
Thanks. Although one can always say that there is also a role for the US to pressure the Israeli government as well.
They're pressuring us all the time, but at the end, listen, I belong to a party which declared that the only solution for this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is a two-state solution. And our government have set an offer which Abu Mazen himself said that he cannot even dream to get from another leader of the state of Israel. As long as, I'm not a speaker of Mr. Netanyahu. I'm a fully opposition of Mr. Netanyahu. I'm not in politics right now, but being at the politics, fully oppose the government of Netanyahu. But on the other hand, it's impossible to start right now the negotiations as long as the Palestinians are settling preconditions to start the negotiation from a position that it's very close to the end of the negotiation. The Americans are putting a lot of pressure on Mr. Netanyahu, and I now trying to think out of the box to get the EU and the United States to make Abu Mazen accept the suggestion that the Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Olmert, have said to him on September 2008. We are out of time. It's 5 years now. By now, they didn't even manage to meet each other.
Okay. There is the theory of the linkage, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is linked to all other issues and all other conflicts, perhaps not all, but many other conflicts in the region, which I believe...
the best proof that that linkage is not correct is what happened in what is called the Arab Spring. All the time, everything what took place in the Middle East, Israel was to blame. It's because your conflict with the Palestinians. What does the revolution in Syria has to do with Israeli-Palestinian conflict? What does the Arab Spring has to do with Israeli-Palestinian conflict? What does the situation right now in Iran, this pursuit after the nuclear weapon, has to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Right. Özgür, does it have anything to do with Turkey?
Well, it has a lot to do with. It has a lot. Yeah, it has a lot to do with Turkey. What I'll try to do is I'll go through how Turkey's current position regarding the changes in the MENA region have evolved over time, and in what ways Turkey has reacted. First of all, let's face the reality. None of the parties that are interested in the developments in the Middle East were prepared for this. So everyone is trying to adapt in his own way. Second, let's also face that there is no single player that has a consistent policy. Everyone is acting with double standards. When I was talking about the surprise effect, there's actually a very interesting anecdote. The Israeli chief of staff was criticized by Israeli media for not predicting the uprising in Egypt. And the Israeli chief of staff said, granted, I couldn't predict it, but the Egyptian chief of staff couldn't predict it either. So the surprise...
The boss was in the same time in Brussels, in the NATO conference, and they were both surprised by the uprising.
And so was Turkey. Turkey, by the way, is this working?
It is.
Okay.
Just
So was Turkey's surprise. But how did Turkey's position evolve over time? So when the uprising started in Tunis, Turkey was totally indifferent, uninterested. And the discussion in Turkey was, and some people were asking, would this trigger an uprising throughout the Arab world? And the people who know the Arab world, supposedly, were saying, no, Tunis is very different from other Arab countries. So what's happening in Tunis will not happen in other places. And Turkey didn't have great stakes with Tunis, not too much economic relations, no territorial closeness. So Turkey was uninterested. When the uprising moved on to Libya, Turkey was terrified for a couple of reasons. First of all, there were very high business interests, Turkish business interests in Libya. A lot of Turkish construction companies were active in Libya, and actually there were 20,000 citizens of Turkey who lived in Libya at that time. So Turkey's main concern was, first of all, evacuating her citizens very successfully, I must say, and citizens of other countries were also evacuated by Turkey very successfully, including like Chinese workers and engineers. And of course, the second priority was not becoming at odds with the late Muammar Gaddafi so that he would pay what he owed to us, a couple of $1 billion. And when NATO was considering making an operation in Libya, the Turkish Prime Minister had said, this is out of area, what does NATO have to do with Libya, together with Germany? So at that point, Turkey's position was that the United States should not intervene, Europe should not intervene, Turkey is not interested in intervening, and NATO should stay out of this. When the uprising spread to Egypt, Turkey was this time delighted because Turkey didn't have very good relations with the late president of Egypt. Ideologically, the Turkish government and the president of Egypt, Mubarak, were at odds because Turkey felt, or the current Turkish government feels affinity to the Muslim Brotherhood groups in the Middle East, whereas Mubarak was just the opposite of Muslim Brotherhood. Also, the Turkish government wasn't too happy with the position that Mr. Mubarak was taking regarding Israel when the Turkish government had problems with Israel. So Turkey was thrilled that there was an uprising in Egypt. And the same Prime Minister of Turkey, who was saying, what does NATO have to do with Libya? Nobody should intervene. Turkey should not intervene. The United States should not intervene. He was the first leader of a country to come out and ask Mr. Mubarak to resign. He wasn't only the first leader, he was also the second. Because before anyone else joined him in asking Mr. Mubarak to resign, he asked him a second time to resign, and only after that, Mr. Obama asked Mr. Mubarak to step down. So you see how Turkey's position was evolving, starting from indifference, panic, delight, and then it came to Syria, when Turkey was literally shocked. Turkey was literally shocked because Turkey's longest land border is with Syria. And there's actually a lot of cultural affinity between parts of Turkey and Syria because there are a lot of Arab Alawites living on Turkey's southern border in both religious and ethnic affinity with some of the people in Syria. And as a matter of fact, the Turkish Prime Minister had been very close to Mr. Assad, who is nowadays called in Turkey Mr. Esed, not as sort of an insult, and the two governments were working very harmoniously. So Turkey's initial reaction to the uprising in Syria was trying to protect Mr. Assad and asking him to let go the Ba'ath Party people around him. So at first Turkey tried to protect Mr. Assad, and Turkish foreign minister went to Syria and had a day-long meeting with Mr. Assad, asking him to reform, actually advising him on how to reform and move towards not necessarily a democracy, but maybe a more open regime. And when Mr. Assad reacted by further killing, then Turkey took the lead in trying to overthrow Mr. Assad. And in time, all of you have seen that Turkey was actually taking the lead in the Transatlantic community in supporting the Syrian opposition in any way you can think, from providing weapons and providing money to safe havening some of their, let's say, operations on the southern borders of Turkey. About 400,000 Syrians have come to Turkey as asylum seekers. Turkey has been providing health care for the militants, the opposition militants who were wounded. And today, actually, Turkey is on one of the sides, is taking sides in what is today called a civil war in Syria. So this is how Turkey's position has evolved over time. But apart from this, the most noticeable change in Turkey's foreign policy has been regarding her relationship with the transatlantic community. After the Cold War and before the Arab uprisings, I'm not calling it a spring anymore, Turkey had gradually moved from being a staunch NATO ally to being a neo-non-aligned member of the transatlantic community. What I mean by neo-non-aligned is Turkey was still part of NATO. Turkey had still very good relations with the United States, but it had strategic autonomy on a set of issues. For example, like on Iran, Turkey's policy was at odds with U.S. foreign policy, and Turkey could manage to balance relations with the United States and having her own foreign policy. But after the Arab Spring, Turkey once again realized that it needed security reassurance of the United States and decided to realign with the United States. And the most important symbol of this realignment has been the decision to host the radar component of the NATO missile defense system in Kürecik, Malatya, part of eastern Turkey. So this has been the evolution of Turkish foreign policy. And just in 30 seconds, what does Turkey expect? Well, Turkey expects, first of all, from the European Union to be more supportive of the revolutionary, quote-unquote revolutionary Arab regimes in terms of financial aid, opening up markets, etc. So more economic aid, not only in terms of direct financial aid, but also in terms of opening up markets. And Turkey expects from the United States to be more active on Syria, basically in terms of militarily engaging the Syrian regime. The expectation in Turkey was so high that the United States would finally intervene that people who know a little bit the United States in Turkey were talking about the United States. There's no chance that the United States is going to directly intervene, and the Turkish government was expecting President Obama to take a decision to intervene right after the elections. But right after the elections, we again saw that there is no appetite, either in the United States or anywhere in Europe, and not anywhere in Turkey, actually, among the Turkish public, for a direct military intervention towards the Syrian regime. And this causes some sort of disappointment among the Turkish government circles. And let me stop here for the time being.
Right. But do you want to say that there was an expectation in the Turkish government for the US to intervene directly in Syria, and it is in disparity between what the public thinks?
Well, like in other places in the transatlantic community, because the German Marshall Fund conducts the Transatlantic Trends Survey every year, and last year we asked the question, if there is a NATO operation to Syria, do you think that your country, Turkey, Germany, whatever, should take part in this intervention? And 67% of Turks said no. And when we asked about a non-NATO intervention, 72% of Turks said that Turkey should have nothing to do with a military operation. So this is actually one thing that the Turkish government has been unable to predict, that the Turkish people do not support military intervention against Syria, even as a retaliation against acts of atrocity by Syria directly to Turkey, like downing a Turkish reconnaissance plane or sending artillery shells to Turkey that have killed 5 Turkish citizens, or even supporting terrorism that recently killed 55 Turks in Reyhanlı. Still, the Turkish people do not want war. And not only do Turkish people don't want Turkey to take part in any intervention, but the Turkish society also doesn't want Westerners to intervene either, despite all the atrocities that Syria has been committing directly towards Turkey. Now, what the Turkish government expects in a more detailed way is one of two things from the United States. Either declare a no-fly zone over the northern territories of Syria alongside the Turkish border. But this means declaring war. I mean, you cannot ask a sovereign state not to use its airspace without declaring war. And then if the United States is not able to, or is not willing to do that, the second demand is to provide the Syrian opposition with high-tech weapons, with advanced weapons, that would be a game changer, like Stinger missiles with which the opposition could down the helicopters of Assad, that Assad uses to transport troops from part of Syria to another part. But let me tell you, it's too late for Stinger missiles anymore, because right now the regime in Syria already controls the highways and they don't need the helicopters to transport troops.
Can you define the opposition in Syria?
Right, Rony, let's leave that. Yeah,
the short answer is I can't.
Such a broad question, but I want to move on to Libya. In Libya, in many respects, there has been a real change, as opposed to Egypt, as opposed to Tunisia and other places. Libya is being built from scratch because it was a country that was made by Gaddafi. So, in other words, even though the new government's building Libya, and there is a lot of turmoil still, wherever you scratch, Gaddafi will come out again. So there is this danger. I wonder how you see things, Anas, and what you expect of the transatlantic community.
Thank you for having me here. I've also had the good fortune of spending the last 2.5 years in cafes. This is where I do my writing, in cafes across the Arab world, from Tangier to Beirut, Egypt, Tunisia, and above and beyond. And from that reason, when you sit in a cafe and you order an espresso, you get a good opportunity to speak to people. And that's what it's all about. The Arab Spring, and I do choose to use the word Arab at least, uprising has given the opportunity to at least 130 million people to have a voice. And I think that in itself is an achievement of some sort. When speaking to people, I think it almost gives you a unique gauge to assess what the temperature is, where are things going, because it starts on the ground. Everyone keeps talking about the street talking, but there are people on the street, and they're the people who do the talking. So in that respect, what Libya wants, I suppose what Libyans want, though I don't claim to be a representative speaker of all Libyans, I claim to be someone that can tell you what's happening in cafes, perhaps. And that in itself is maybe a gift to myself. I'd have to respond to the first problem and challenge, which is that there needs to be a rethinking, an overhaul of this, quite frankly, horrible framework within which the Arab world is being understood. We're always given unique perspectives wherever we go, but a unique perspective when we have people that are involved in tier 2 diplomacy, in diplomacy itself, scholars, governments. It gives you that unique fora to discuss ideas, academia, which is really what nourishes policy making, and calling things by their true and proper name, which is what the job of a scholar is. And I think today, this idea that there is some sort of Arab exceptionalism, Arab populations who choose to voice their political demands through the clothing of Islam, and I call it the clothing of Islam because they're ultimately the same things, whichever clothing they wear, secular, religious or otherwise, is somehow antithetical to democracy or the concepts that we hold or the values that we celebrate across the free world. So I think that's the first big challenge, is that we have to shift attitudes, because it's all from Tangier to Beirut, literally. There's absolutely no discrepancy, I think. People in Beirut, I was there for the last few months, were telling me that this is the Arab Spring is a massive conspiracy. It's to strengthen Israelis, it's to strengthen American foreign policy. In Tangier, they're saying we're forgotten about. In Libya, they see themselves as some sort of exception, but Libyans have a long century and 102 years history of fascism. You know, the breed of Mussolini and the breed of Gaddafi was absolutely no different. I'm often asked when I get into a taxi, where are you from? And I say Libya, and they say, Gaddafi. And I say, no, I'm not from Gaddafi, I'm from Libya, because quite frankly, I want to get away from him. And most Libyans live under the shadow of an individual called Gaddafi. And most Arabs live under the shadow of someone that speaks on their behalf that doesn't really speak their language, doesn't really talk about their aims, their ambitions, and what is central, what is a theme that goes across the Arab world. And many things. In academic terms and scholarly terms, it's just effectively macro socioeconomic failure across the board. I mean, that's failures in transportation and health and education and employment. When Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunis, when he burnt himself, many will say, yes, he burned himself because of it's an undignified lifestyle and, you know, he was slapped in the face by an official in the Tunisian government. But he's also a fruit and veg seller. And when his license, he didn't have a license and it was revoked, and his stall was moved, he couldn't feed his sisters. If you couldn't do this, and most people would just say, it's this, then he's going to burn himself. And that struck a chord with most Arabs because they thought, well, hold on a second, I'm breaking my back every day and I can't, you know, even afford to pay for my kids. But the real kick, I mean, the real stab in the back is that I'm not even given a fora. I'm not given space to voice those grievances and frustrations. I mean, that is ultimately adds insult to injury. And that's central to what's happening in the Arab world. I would say, to go back to this idea of a framework, a failed one, I would say the transatlantic community have to kind of really assess whether or not they have, especially in Europe, which is going its most pertinent existential crisis in memory. It's facing economic Armageddon tête-à-tête. It doesn't even know where the euro will be next year, let alone where the eurozone will be. And I think the sooner that we accept this reality, the sooner we're able to find solutions to go there. Because I personally can't, being in the southern Mediterranean neighborhood, I personally can't envisage looking north and thinking that the EU doesn't exist. Many people outside of the neighborhood, many people outside of the European community cannot envisage that happening because they're used to speaking to people from the EU, they're used to some sort of congeniality, some sort of cohesive parole, even though if it's not even an action, as we found in Libya, that France and Britain really took the lead in amidst a EU, in amidst a NATO, in amidst a US-backed unified protector resolution which came to Libya's savior at the end. Most people cannot envisage a EU, whether it works or doesn't work, that is not existing. So the first of these attitudes is that, especially when there is a massive financial crisis, people fall back to what they know. Politicians, diplomats will fall back to what they know. And ultimately, it's the same old speech, which is effectively security, stability, and the question of Israel. And the question of Israel is a central theme to this, obviously. I heard what Ron had to say, and I think I was somewhat bemused, somewhat, I don't know if I'm confused or not as to what Israel's position is and how the transatlantic community can put further pressure on the Palestinians. As an anecdote, and I'm young, so I'll be forgiven for this, but when Ron said thinking outside of the box, the only box I can think of is the cardboard box that Palestinians are expected to live in. And most Arabs across the Arab world think they don't understand these terms on the table. I don't know how a two-state solution seems to be a liberal or a value-based judgment on something that is almost a gift, when most people are concerned that today exists, and this is an Arab perception. I don't presume to be thinking that this is something that is shared in Central Europe or the transatlantic community. But the perception, and the perception is crucial here because it's also a reality, is that Palestinians are abused on a daily basis, that this is apartheid. It is no different to what's happening in South Africa. There's a huge wall being erected in an era where here in Europe we know what happened with walls and how they are meant to fall. And most people would be quite sure that there's something quite wrong when after you've erected so many walls, so many checkpoints, so many human rights abuses that you're asked to put further pressure. I don't know what that could mean. So I'm bemused, but I'm looking forward to Ron's response from that. So I think in that sense, there needs to be a real shift in attitude towards this unconditional support of Israel. Because, yes, there was an incredible movement, speed, of ferocious nature, which brought, and brought to the fore an incredible mission in Libya, which minimized civilian casualties, that even though NATO was involved, did not have that many civilian casualties. But at the same time, many will be thinking this is just, double speech, double talk. There's there is one condition for Libyans because we have oil. Once again, that is a perception. And one for Syrians, one for Palestinians. And the Palestinian case runs central, again, to what we believe, at least in Libya, of 42 years, one of the longest dictatorships in the Arab world, of laxing basic freedoms, values, the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, dignity and human rights. And what runs central to that, obviously, is the, atrocious nature of what is going on across the Arab world. And that is ultimately no more symbolized than in Palestine. So I think in that respect, some conditionality has to come into the play. It's obviously a no-brainer that there is a special relationship with Israel from the Transatlantic community. I don't think Arabs are under any kind of illusions that there will be some sort of, that they'll be sitting on the same bench and talking as equals. I don't think many Arabs think that. And again, that is a perception. But it's definitely a perception that runs true from Tangier to Beirut. This idea of securitizing things because, and I go to quote, that we have fundamental Islamic regimes, as Ron said, in Egypt. If there is to be this, let's fall back on what we know. Let's deal with secular but very aggressive autocracies in the Arab world who malign their population, who, in the name of stability, we keep there and we prop them up with aid. And because they're no longer there anymore, we can't talk to Islamists. The very fact of the matter is that Islamists have come to parliament, have come to presidency in democratically elected, EU-monitored elections over the past year and a half. They've pretty much swept it. So what is that saying? It's saying that contrary to popular belief, that Arabs, Islam, mosques are places where only plots to bring down the West or bring down Israel abroad. It's actually quite the opposite. In fact, mosques have been the only place for most Arabs where they can discuss politics, where they can actually get away from the state. And I think we have to accept that that's also true for lots of people. This is why I was saying earlier on that these freedoms are dressed in Islamic clothing, but they're nothing to be scared of. I think if we start going back on our commitments here, then people start saying, well, there's one rule for them and there's one rule for us. And I think we have to accept that for at least 40 years, most people have seen, at least from, in fact, 56, 57 years from Bourguiba and Tunis of imposing, and it wasn't imposed, top-down, state-imposed project of secularism across the Arab world, which was not the way in which secularism came to Europe, has had catastrophic consequences. And now most people feel that a consequence of the Arab Spring is that they can revitalize and revisit their theological freedoms as well as their other democratic freedoms, and they will go hand in hand. The idea or notion of stability for the region and for Israel, the idea of security because of anti-terrorism, have to be revisited, because if we don't speak to all parties on the table, or we only invite certain parties on the table, then we've not learned anything, and the Arab Spring is an isolated incident and remains maligned and resigned to only one region. And it's not a global conversation as Arabs would like it to be. To answer the final question of who, and Ron asked the question, who are the Syrian opposition? I would say the Syrian opposition were at the beginning a mixture and a composition and as we say in Libyan Arabic, a slata, a salad of many factors, many people, many actors, many different ethnicities that did not think of it in terms of a sectarian, violent struggle with certain ones here and certain friends and certain foes, but really something that would try to, at the very, very least, bring back some equity to their table. Not everybody wanted from the opposition just to bring down Assad. Somebody wanted to have a better life. And I think now, given the current circumstances, it's not really trying to broker opposition-Assad talks. It's really trying to broker opposition from within talks. The opposition are not talking to each other. They are a mixture of people that are now looking within and having arguments because of losses on the battlefield. I agree to my colleague on the right of saying that they could have been armed more appropriately, but because of emboldened positions, I'll wrap up, because of emboldened positions in Beijing, in Moscow, since the UN Resolution 1971 of Libya, and people realize that responsibility to protect really just means regime change, everybody's clued on now. The international community know that, and they don't want to let it go through that way again. So I think we have to look at new forms of dealing with things when speech, freedom of speech, are values that we celebrate here in Europe, and Poland knows that more than anybody else. When they won't stand up to brute force, then you have to look at ways of trying to protect them. But otherwise, they'll be lost. Thank you.
Thanks, Anas. With much of what you've said, one cannot argue. But on the other hand, just one word of caution. I think that we fall, or that there is this risk that we think that we live in exceptional times, whereas when you read, when you do your reading, for instance, throughout the 20th century, I found a piece by Alfred Halpern for the Rand Corporation from 1963. And this, if you read his paper, it's as if you were reading about 2011, about the Arab awakening. It's as if there was a revolution in the Middle East. So also on the Arab exceptionalism, I completely agree with you. I do not believe it exists, but still, important and wise people, like Ernest Gellner, for instance, in his book, The Muslim Society in 1981, he actually articulated on 300 pages how the Muslim society is perhaps inherently incapable at the moment of writing, I don't know, of a Western style civil society.
Should we judge it by Western yardsticks?
It's just that my point is that he was not a neocon. He was not, he's a person that you read him when you study international relations. He wrote the book, Nations and Nationalism. And so vis-a-vis that, you do have Edmund Burke III, for instance, who argued on the contrary, that there is no Arab exceptionalism back then in the 80s. And so now we find ourselves, and indeed it turns out that Burke was right and Gellner was wrong, but there is, I mean, you cannot discredit his thoughts offhand. I mean, we would have to go point by point.
I don't mean to. I think my final point was just saying that we have a golden opportunity, because whilst they were speaking in theory, today it's in practice and it's a reality. There are massive existential changes that are going across the Arab world, and if we don't seize on them, then we lose this to our own peril. That's my point.
Okay, thanks a lot. Now, before I give the floor to Orhan, I just want to let you know that after he speaks, you will be asked to ask questions, and so if you have any, please make sure to raise your hand. Orhan, this question has to come up. The situation in Turkey today, in the streets in Istanbul, could you decipher what's happening?
Sure, thank you. I'm a late addition to this panel, so I'm not going to take too long of your time and let my fellow panelists to answer the questions. In our region, it typically doesn't really make sense to talk about short-term developments and how it affects, because, you know, it's much longer developments which counts. However, I certainly do believe, especially from the point of the transatlantic relations, what has transpired in Turkey over the last couple of weeks are so important. It will not only change the way that Turkey as a country, I'm not talking about Turkish government, will continue to act vis-a-vis the region and its transatlantic relations. So therefore, I think it's worthwhile to spend at least a couple of minutes on it. I'm not going to go into many of the details, but I just came from Istanbul. I have never seen this much international interest on events in Turkey. These are some of the newspapers I picked up on the way here. And for the last 3 days, we are always on the front page with a big picture. The last time I've seen that was in 1974 during the Cyprus crisis. So that's actually something to think about when you put things about that. Why this much Western interest on Turkey and what's happening there right now? That's one point. 2 weeks ago, before everything started, the focus in Turkey was, as Özgür said, mainly on Syria, on our foreign policy front, on the Kurdish opening, on the domestic front. And of course, the Kurdish opening has a lot of foreign policy implications as well, especially vis-a-vis northern Iraq, the Kurdish regional government, and to a certain effect on Syria as well. I am some sort of an energy guy as well, so let me also remind the audience here about the importance of energy in Turkey's foreign policy. Turkey basically does not have any energy, or at least fossil energy sources. We import almost every a cubic inch of gas and every barrel of oil. The energy bill that Turkey faces is about $60 billion a year, which is basically our equivalent to our current account deficit, which is the biggest problem in the relatively well-running economy. So Turkey's foreign policy, besides all the other things that has mentioned that you can think of, is very much depending on Turkey's dependency on energy sources. Therefore, an Israeli apology was very well accepted. That's related to, in my humble opinion, to a great extent to Eastern Mediterranean gas. As a matter of fact, people are even talking about normalizing the relationships with Cyprus, which has control over some of that gas in Eastern Mediterranean. The relationships with the Kurdish regional government and as well as Iraq were some of the main issues. Turkish Prime Minister was in Washington less than a month ago with 5 of the ministers, 100 businessmen. I was there myself. And the Prime Minister was incredibly welcomed, very well welcomed by President Obama, stayed at the Blair House, had dinner with him, so everything was going quite well. How the US-Turkish relationships basically shaped up since then, especially after the events of 2 weeks ago, is quite interesting that I want to share with this audience. Soon after the protest started regarding what we call Gezi Park, Taksim Square in Turkey, the US State Department issued a statement, especially criticizing the excessive force used on the protesters. A day later, another statement came. Again, just like the way that I haven't seen any of these things in more than 30 years, in the recent history, I don't really remember the US State Department issuing 2 consecutive statements in less than 3 days on, at that point, what seemed to be a purely domestic, if not an environmental or ecological issue. So the Turkish Foreign Minister, Mr. Davutoğlu, called Secretary Kerry and in very harsh words criticized the US involvement in that. And he basically, according to the leaks to the press, he mentioned to Secretary Kerry, Turkey is not a second-class democracy, and Turkey does not really need that much of a warning or advice from the United States. I'm going to cut it short. In the last 2 weeks, 4 different statements came from the State Department, and if I'm not mistaken, 3 from the administration, from the White House, and 1 of them came from the Vice President Biden. And also another tweet was well-publicized tweet came from the US Embassy in Ankara, all criticizing Turkish government's use of excessive force and basically treatment of this process. Now, I mentioned what I haven't seen since Cyprus. I have been following protests in Turkey myself, being from Istanbul since 1977, the famous May 1st incident. In almost every protest in Turkey, or especially I can say even in the region, it's fashionable to basically blame the United States. You typically see some people burning American flags, chanting anti-American slogans. This time around, there was none of them. None of them. So there's the anti-American sentiment. There wasn't much there in the public, but among the protesters, especially considering that some of the more aggressive demonstrators were from the leftist groups, as a sudden, they became big allies of the United States. And that's basically because the United States, through its statements, showed that they are behind transatlantic values. Freedom of speech, a much more functional democracy, which was incredibly welcome. So the way that I want to summarize this, in the last 2 weeks, things changed. The old-time demonstrators, the rebels, are now very big friends of the United States. And then the government is having very, very hard time dealing both with the administration and the State Department. Same thing is happening with Europe. Some of you may know that the European Parliament yesterday passed a very, very harsh resolution on the Turkish government's actions vis-à-vis the demonstrators and the protesters. And the Prime Minister today basically told that he doesn't recognize them. So again, I'm not going to go into the relationship with the EU because I can't talk for the rest 2 hours or the rest of the evening. But right now, obviously, the Turkish government is in direct odds with the Transatlantic community, whereas the public in general, or at least a portion of the public, is as a sudden has realized that there is a lot of merit in transatlantic values. So let me stop there and give it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I invite questions from you. Should you have any? Sir, please.
Rasim Akdoğan. I'm a businessman from Turkey.
You need to...
Is it working?
Okay.
I'm a businessman from Turkey. If I may, I have two questions for Mr. Baron. Just like Mr. Özgür said, there are polls in Turkey almost every day, if not every week, about what people think about war and protesting and foreign policy. How about in Israel? Do you recognize any polls being made in the people of Israel towards peace? What is the percentage support of peace in Israel people? And that is my first question. And second question is, now everybody's talking about gas reserves in the East Mediterranean. How would that help towards a peaceful Mediterranean? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
Also address Anna's.
I better do not address Anas, but maybe I'll find time later on. Thank you for your question. Yes, polls are taking place in Israel, and the best polls in Israel are actually the elections. Well, the stability of the governments of Israel is not such a big success. Talking about tenure for Israel government is 4 years, and since our independence we have 65 years. It means that right now should govern the 16 government, correct? I'm doing good work in mathematics. Well, actually, this is the 33rd government. And talking about the polls, the best poll is the election. Unfortunately, most of the people in Israel does not agree with my position, and they vote for the right wing in Israel. So the last two governments are the government of the wing side of the political map in Israel. In spite of that, most of the Israeli, also Prime Minister Netanyahu, have declared that the only solution is a two-state solution. And let me explain this for you. If we don't split the land between us and the Palestinians, Israel, in the Independence Declaration, have stated that Israel is a Jewish democratic country. If we are not going to split the land between us and the Palestinians, it's either we won't be a Jewish nation or we won't be a democratic nation. If we won't split the land and we'll keep all the Palestinians within the Israeli state and we give them the right to vote to our parliament, within less than 20 years, the majority of the state of Israel won't be Jewish anymore. And let me remind you that Israel is the only Jewish state all over the world. And if we don't give them the right to elect to the parliament, we won't be democratic. And here I want to refer what Anas said. You listen to Anas, he speaks very frankly from the bottom of his heart. But he describes the whole trouble of the whole Arab people all over the world is the problem of Israel. We are to be blamed of what Assad is massacring in Syria. We are to be blamed of all human rights which is broken in most of the Arab countries up to the uprising, the right of free speech. Why don't you look at your place, at your country, and don't interfere? Go and ask the Palestinians, have you ever been there? Their quality of life, yes, I know, we don't want anybody, does not want another people or another state to govern them. They deserve a state, a free state of their own. But the quality of their life is 10 times better than the quality of the life of many, many of the Arabs countries that you've been spoken to the people in those cafes around the table of an espresso. Compare what they had on 67 under the Jordanian regime. On that time, 10 babies out of 1,000 babies didn't reach up the first year of their life. Today, they have the same figures like us. Less than 1 baby out of 2,000 people. They have the same quality of the medical system that we have. Well, a lot of them are working in our place. Not that this is the solution. What I have stated in my opening remarks is that as for myself, I know that Israel has to do more. But as long as we stick to this idea fix that the United States have to put some more pressure on Israel, and the EU have to put some more pressure on Israel, we'll go on with this conflict for another 100 of years. This conflict lasts now for 100 years. And it was so close. I'm not speaking out of talking just to people. I've been there in the room, in the cabinet. I know exactly what were the maps that Ehud Olmert introduced to Abbas, and he told him, just sign of it. He said, yes, I have to go. Well, someone have to admit that on that time, Olmert was already a goner. He quit being prime minister formally, and he didn't was the head of my party anymore. And yes, I can understand that Abbas says, now Olmert cannot deliver the goods. But if he was declaring that he accept the plan of Olmert, Netanyahu, that came 3 months or 4 months later, was committed to the commission, to the offer that Olmert has done. Now, as for the gas, well, I think the gas is great opportunity for Israel and for the regime. I think that cooperation between Israel and Turkey, between Israel and some other countries with digging the gas out of the earth might influence a lot the geopolitical situation of Israel and the whole geopolitical situation in the regime. And I want to raise one more point. Everybody in Israel came upon us when Morsi took power in Egypt and said, listen, it's the most fundamental Islamistic regime ever made. As a couple of my friends said over here. But I said, listen to this. Morsi is now the president of Egypt. Egypt is governed by the Muslim Brothers. And still, the peace treaty that was signed between Begin and Sadat 35 years ago, Morsi is still keeping this peace treaty. Can you imagine a better opportunity for both sides?
Right. Any more questions? Sir, please.
Thanks very much. Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform in London. I wanted to get a bit further east than the Israel-Palestine conflict. One of the areas where there has been successful cooperation between Europe and the US has been over Iran and the Iranian nuclear program. But it does seem that at the moment, while we are concentrating on various packages of sanctions, The Iranians are actually making enormous geopolitical gains across the Middle East with the sort of consolidation of their position with the Iraqi government, and obviously with what at the moment looks like greater successes on the battlefield for the Assad regime, and with the heightened profile of Hezbollah in Lebanon. So the question I have is, what should the Europeans and the US be doing to address this issue? And have we sort of taken our eyes off the ball because we're so fixated on the nuclear program that we are not seeing the big picture of what Iran is doing more generally in the region?
Thanks. Let's have more questions at the back there.
Grzegorz Kobyłecki. I would like to ask you about, let's say, explanation or about your opinion about the two figures, which I found in the West newspapers last days. First of them is the, let's say, yesterday in Die Welt in German newspaper says that in Syria, according intelligence services of Germany, fighting 5% of Syrian people and 95% of foreigners from more as 20 countries. And the second figures, this is, let's say, information which I found, an article in Washington Post. Washington Post says that after 2 years of terrible war in Syria, almost 100,000 people is died. 75% of the population of Syria supporting Assad. I would like to hear your opinion about this. Let's say, because this is everybody knows also that, let's say, this situation, the development of the situation in Syria will have very big influence of relationship between Israel and Palestinian. So then these three issues, if you can give your opinion, explanation.
Right. So basically the Islamization of the opposition and the fighting people and huge support for Assad according to the numbers that the gentleman has found. And the Iranian question, Özgür, can you go with that?
Sure. First of all, about Syria, President Assad has proved very skillful in transforming the Syrian opposition from a human rights movement to a sectarian movement. As we all know, in the beginning, the Syrian opposition, or let's say the Syrian uprising, was A, very peaceful, and B, it was very diverse, with even some Alevites in it, and C, it wasn't sectarian at all. And thanks to President Assad and his active politics, A, it's not peaceful anymore because there is a war going on. B, it's increasingly less diverse, it's increasingly more Sunni. And C, also, it's not, now they are not only fighting for human rights, but they are also fighting for sectarian reasons. Now, President Assad claims that there are foreign fighters on Syrian soil. I wouldn't go into any numbers, and I think it's impossible to come up with any numbers, but I think that Assad is exaggerating. Now, the opposition is claiming that there are foreign fighters, meaning Iranian and Hezbollah. Probably both Assad is right and the opposition is right. Of course there are foreign fighters. When you have a civil war on a fault line of sectarian differences, the foreign fighters will come in to join for very understandable reasons. Now, on Iran, maybe my other colleagues or fellow panelists would also like to contribute. But Iran has also been very talented in terms of transforming the conflict between Iran and the West into one with the Shiites and the rest. And therefore strengthening its position. And if there is now a Cold War based on sectarian fault lines in the Middle East, this is the result of, I think, very successful planning of Tehran.
Cold War?
Cold War. I mean, well,
100,000 people killed about this. It's a Cold War.
No, Sunni Shia Cold War.
no, I mean Sunni Shia. Well, yeah.
Rony, you want?
Well, why nobody is mentioning arms supplied to Assad by Russia? It's not only Iran which supplies Assad with those devices that makes him so successfully killing more than 100,000 people. The Iranian big plan is to make the big, I don't know the English word for that, caliphate. That's the word, okay. They want to control the whole Arab, Islamic world and the Middle East and everybody included. And they're working through the proxies. The proxy is Hezbollah, which is going to ruin, read my lips, is going to destroy within a couple of years the whole state of Lebanon. And they are doing it with Hamas, which is working, used to work in Damascus, and now is dealing with our western border near Gaza.
Nice. Last word perhaps to you, Anas, very shortly, and we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I'll just wrap up. So I suppose within terms of Iran, I think it's mostly overstated. I think there are massive, clear ethnic and ideological, theological even differences between the Shias. They're not a monolithic bunch by any stretch of the imagination. They're not all like, I met many Shia in Lebanon who despise the influence that they have, who don't particularly find themselves represented by Hezbollah, don't feel that there are as many links as one makes, but I mean, the jury's still out. So I mean, I wouldn't really kind of push it so far. I wouldn't push it so far. There's obviously influence there. I'm not so sure about a grand plan for a khilafah that goes across the Arab world. I'm sure most Tunisians, Arabs, Libyans, Egyptians, Jordanians would be at odds with this, but again, that's just my opinion. I would still like to just respond to one thing that Ron said. In terms of quality of life, I mean, I did spend, I think it was last week, someone sent me a video of a Palestinian woman with her 18-month-old baby being punched in the face by an IDF soldier. So I'm not sure what quality of life that is, and I'm not sure if Ron would spend a year living in Gaza. Would you, Ron? Would you spend a year living in Gaza with the current standards of life that they're given? I don't know.
The people in Gaza, if they would spend a year living in Libya under Gaddafi.
Of course not. But then, you know, it's even worse when it's...
So stick to the problem you are...
Oh, no, but I'm a human. I'm compelled to talk about these things, okay. Ron. As a human, I feel I'm compelled to, and as somebody that stands up for the virtues of these things.
By a unilateral move, have escaped, have went out of Gush Katif in Gaza. And instead of acknowledging what Arik Sharon has done, it was a great debate. It almost cut the Israeli, divided the Israeli by half.
Right.
This disengagement from Gaza. And what do we get from that? We get from that 7 years, 8,000 missiles, 8,000 rockets fired, not at soldiers, at children on the exact time
I've heard this
of traveling to school.
Gentlemen, so this discussion can go on, and I've been there, and I've been there. So, Anas.
That's why you should interfere and put the pressure on both sides to cut this agony.
Let me wrap up then. Thanks, Anas. Sorry for being so abrupt, but I thought this panel would be dominated by the Turkish question. It turned out otherwise. We're not as silly as the papers. We know where the real problems are. And I think that there are much more. There is much more than we've touched upon, and we've touched upon so many. So with that, I want to thank the panel, Orhan, Anas, Özgür, Rony. Thank you very much, and thanks to the audience.